Okay, so welcome again to this is the fourth class in the series of teachings on Master Shantideva's fourth and fifth chapters, the fourth chapter being on conscientiousness, the fifth chapter on this guarding alertness that we need. We're going to start with a few prayers, so I'm going to go ahead and share the screen where I do have those prayers up so we can recite them together. So we begin with this homage to Shakyamuni Buddha, which we'll do 3 times. The endowed transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond, the foe destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and human beings, to you, the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. To the founder, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond, the foe destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and human beings, to you, the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. To the founder, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond, the foe destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teach gods and human beings, to you, the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan. I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. So then we'll do, the short mandala offering. Again, we'll just do this in English, this prayer followed by the offering mantra. This ground anointed with perfume, strewn with flowers, with Mount Meru, 4 continents, the sun and the moon. I imagine this as a Buddha field and offer it. May all living beings enjoy this pure land. Idam Guru Ratna Mandalakam Niryatayami. Then we'll do refuge and bodhicitta before the teaching. We'll do this twice in the English and then, once in the English and then twice in the Tibetan. I go for refuge until I am enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the merits I create through listening to the Dharma, may I become a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings. Sangye chodang soki choknam la, jangchu bardu dakni kyabsu chi, daki chunyen gipe sunam gi, drola panchir sangye drupar shog. Sangye chodang soki choknam la, jangchu bardu dakni kyabsu chi, daki chunyen gipe sunam gi, drola panchir sangye drupar shog. Okay. So go ahead and do a short meditation before we begin. Give ourselves a chance to focus the mind a bit and to generate a good motivation for participating in this class. So just find a good meditation posture, one that works for your body, where the body is somewhat upright and straight, as well as having a relaxed tone to the body, making sure that you release tension as best as you can. And then begin to pay attention to the breath. And whatever mode that you work with the breath, if you don't have a particular meditation you use with the breath, then I'll suggest tuning into the sensation in the area of the nostrils where you feel the air coming in and going out. And that sensation that occurs in that area becomes your meditation object. And simply stay present with it as best as you can. And whatever technique you're using with the breath, we need this factor of introspection, this guarding alertness, checking in occasionally to see the quality of our meditation. And if we check in and we see that the mind has wandered, that we've gotten distracted, then we recognize that that's happened and simply return to the breath, letting go of whatever it was that distracted us. If we check in and the mind is doing fine, then we can just simply check out and check in again later. So I'll ring the bell to begin this little period of meditation. And then after a few minutes in silence, I'll lead you in a short reflection to set your motivation for this evening. So now let's set our motivation together. And certainly with what's all transpiring in the world right now, things that are going on, and we have great evidence around us of the unsatisfactory nature of existence that we can funnel into our motivation. To first of all, see this for ourselves, to recognize that this state we call samsara is one that we have been in since beginningless time. We've experienced sufferings like this in terms of, viral outbreaks, things like this, as well as countless other forms of suffering and the myriad numbers of lives that we've experienced since beginningless time. As long as we are under the control of our own karma and delusions, as long as those afflictions continue to run the show, we will continue to have these unsatisfactory experiences. This chapter that we're working with right now in Master Shantideva is about generating this conscientiousness that is attentive to what's going on in our minds, that is wanting to move in a better direction in terms of moving away from those states of affliction towards more wholesome, virtuous states of mind. So the initial motivation we might bring to tonight is to see through the evidence that we have around us this unsatisfactory nature of existence, and therefore the strong determination to use our time together to move in the direction of being liberated from the causes of our own state of samsara, being liberated from our karma, our delusions, and attaining a true peace that the Buddha says is completely attainable. So this is the first level of motivation, is to want to engage in these teachings for yourself and to really have that genuine renunciation that moves away from these patterns towards what will lead to liberation. But generating this mind in regard to our own situation is only part of the equation, especially since these are Mahayana teachings we're engaging in. Master Shantideva isn't encouraging us to overcome our afflictions simply for ourselves. He wants us to be able to attain the state of enlightenment, the state of Buddhahood, where we can help others to do the same work, where we will be fully qualified and capable, and we'll be able to bring all sentient beings to the state of enlightenment as well through our own attainment of enlightenment. This is the mind of bodhicitta, this greater purpose that we are always trying to be in touch with, this mind that is the ultimate mind to develop in terms of our motivation, the wish to help all sentient beings, together with the recognition that to do that most capably, we need to develop our own qualities. We need to become a Buddha. So try to bring that motivation to these teachings in particular, in addition to wanting your own liberation from suffering, wanting this for all beings, wanting all beings to attain enlightenment, and your recognition that becoming enlightened yourself is the best way for that to happen. Okay. So I don't know what happened to Richard. It looks like he's not with us right now, but we'll hopefully have him returning. So once more, this is the continuing series that we're doing on Master Shantideva's 4th and 5th chapters. The 4th chapter, as I mentioned earlier, is on conscientiousness. This is the title of it. And the first 3 chapters, once more, just as a brief review, because this class actually hasn't met for several weeks because we had a few things interrupting us. But essentially, the first 3 chapters were all about bodhicitta, kind of the first one talking about the great benefits of bodhicitta and the cultivation of that mind. And then the next 2, the second and the third, which were all about deepening our commitment to bodhicitta, to this path, by engaging in the 7-limb practice prior to taking the vows. Recalling that again, the vows are when our bodhicitta becomes more operative in the world, where we actually have that engaging bodhicitta, as opposed to the aspirational bodhicitta that we just developed as part of our motivation. So now we're getting into the instructions that Master Shantideva is giving us in terms of how do we make that bodhicitta into something much more active. We've looked in this, go ahead and go to the slides at this point that I've been using for going through this text. Chapter 4, again, has a short explanation that we went through. We got into a more extensive explanation of this topic of conscientiousness, this wholesome state of mind where we are attending to what's going on. Again, it has that same root as conscience. It's kind of our internal conscience that keeps us committed to practicing a path of virtue, to avoiding non-virtue, and so on. So the very first part of it was looking at our conscientiousness for bodhicitta, not wanting to lose that mind. Once more, seeing how important it is that we continue to strengthen and develop that mind, because that mind is the essential part of the bodhisattva path. But then the main part of this text was looking at being conscientious in the trainings. And by the trainings, we mean specifically the 3 things here that we've already covered, 2, the third one. The first one is to have that conscientiousness with regard to faulty behavior, the non-virtue that will lead us to unfortunate states where we won't be capable of helping others, and we moreover will have to suffer from those states of existence. So it is important that we abandon the faults, the non-virtue. It's also important that we have some conscious meditation and practice of virtue, the opposing states that are helping us to accumulate more merit, to have more positive potential, and to, of course, achieve results that will be useful for us and for other beings. The third that we're in right now is conscientiously abandoning the afflictions, recognizing that this is the work that all of us have to do, whether we're seeking our own liberation or whether we're seeking Buddhahood. One of the steps is certainly to gain control over our minds and to lessen the tendency to have these afflictions, these delusions arising. So this kind of parallels a verse that sometimes we recite before teachings, especially with Lama Zopa Rinpoche, though here at our center in Santa Fe, we also try to recite that frequently, on Sundays at least, is this verse that's essentially saying, do not commit any non-virtuous actions, Perform only perfect virtuous actions. Subdue your mind thoroughly. This is the teaching of the Buddha. So these three concepts are kind of the essential training, the essential teaching of the Buddha, especially in regard to the Bodhisattva path, but nonetheless, all practitioners, whether they're on the path that leads to one's own liberation or the path that leads to full enlightenment for the sake of others, we have to do this. We have to, first of all, not commit those non-virtuous actions. Secondly, perform whatever virtue we can. And thirdly, we have to subdue our minds. So that's why, again, this whole course I decided to call Mastering the Mind, because it really is the main instruction in terms of how we go about changing our minds, getting rid of those negative tendencies and engaging in more positive states of mind. And then our behavior follows from that. So again, conscientiously abandoning the afflictions, as we saw previously, this has 3 outlines. I don't have space on a single slide to keep them all in there lined up. So we're going to go into the first outline, was where we were last time, and we only had a verse. Anyway, that line within this idea of abandoning afflictions is about contemplating the faults of afflictions. We saw that there were 3 outlines for that. I won't go through the other 2, but essentially the third one is generating the courage to destroy them. Kind of having seen the faults, having seen that these afflictions are not our friend, that they actually cause us great suffering, that they are behind all of what we've experienced in samsara that is unfavorable, that is undesirable, that we have to generate this courageous mind that wishes to destroy them. So this is the verse 36 that we're at right now, according to what I had written down. I realize it's a few weeks ago. If I'm wrong on that, maybe someone can chime in, but I think this is where we left off. So verse 36 indicates, therefore, as long as this enemy is not overcome with certainty before my very eyes, I shall never give up exerting myself against it. And then he uses an example here. He says, self-important people, prideful people who become angry even at slight, short-lived harm will not go to sleep until it is overcome. So he kind of uses this example of, when we do see in the world at large, some people, when they've been offended by somebody, somebody has done something negative to them, they won't sleep, they won't do anything until they've attained their revenge, until they've gotten back at them. This is a good example in terms of it's an unfavorable behavior, but it works in the same way. It's like we see people that get so committed to rectifying some wrong that was caused to them, and they put all of their energy into that, but that energy, of course, is wasted, and that energy actually produces unfavorable results. Well, in the same way, we're seeing now the faults of the afflictions and not wanting to overcome, and we do want to overcome them. So we have to get that mind that is intent upon doing whatever we can to overcome them, to have that same sort of stamina and striving that ordinary beings would put into retaliating at somebody. We have to do the same thing with regard to overcoming the afflictions. So I'm going to read a little bit from the this is Gyaltsab Je's commentary that Venerable Fedor translated, that you all should have. Again, I'm not putting a lot of this up on the screen. A little bit later, I might put some when we transition into chapter 5. But Gyaltsab Je says, since everything unwished for is generated by the afflictions, just as we've seen in the previous verses, until I have not definitely destroyed this terrifying enemy directly, it is appropriate that I shall not give up, even for one moment, striving in the antidote to the afflictions while I am here in this migration. So there's this kind of commitment being made saying, as long as this is the case, because the afflictions are so harmful, I'm not going to give up striving against them. I'm going to be continuously doing everything I can to overcome them in the best way possible. So he continues and he says, if the very proud worldly people get angry at even small harms, such as harsh words, they will be very vengeful. Sleep will elude them, and they will not rest until they have destroyed their enemy. So again, using that worldly example as somebody who's obsessed with getting back at someone, retaliating for what harm they've done to them. So he concludes and says, therefore, in the same way, and essentially, it is appropriate to strive in destroying the enemy of the afflictions. So this is, again, Master Shantideva advising us to do the work that we can to antidote the afflictions. And I thought at this point, because since I don't think I talked about it a few weeks ago, it's just to touch briefly on some of the antidotes to the delusions. Essentially, we know that the ultimate antidote to all the delusions, and we're going to touch on this a little bit later in chapter 4 as well, is the wisdom realizing emptiness, the wisdom realizing that this self, especially that we grasp upon so tightly that we think is inherently existent, this misconception of a self can be removed. This is a fictitious mind, or a mind that has a fictitious object, let's put it that way. That fictitious object can be refuted because it is not grounded in truth. The wisdom of emptiness sees that it lacks that it is not possessing that inherent existence. So that wisdom is the final antidote. And if we have the ability to, through our study and practice, to bring emptiness to mind, it can be a really, really helpful way to overcome the delusions in the moment. It's the most powerful way that we eventually do overcome them, when we directly realize emptiness through meditation, and we're able to change the mind at a very deep level. But nonetheless, we can bring that to mind if possible, and that's said to be the antidote to all of them. It's an across-the-board antidote. When we have the mind of attachment, we can think about the emptiness of the I that is feeling that desire. We can have the emptiness of the object that is the object of that desire. We can have the emptiness of the act of wanting that, of trying to procure that. All of these things can be meditated upon. When we see that none of this is real in the way that we think it is, once more, it's a very powerful antidote, regardless of whether it's attachment, hatred, uh, ignorance, pride, jealousy, any of these other afflicted states of mind. The temporal antidotes, on the other hand, are those things that we introduce that are generally targeted a little bit more specifically at that particular delusion. So I'll give some examples in terms of the main two. Again, we often talk about the three root poisons or root afflictions. Ignorance is one of them. Again, this ignorance that is adhering to things to inherently exist. This is definitely the root of all of them. But the other two that are attachment and aversion, or hatred, anger. There's different names, again, that translators use for that. But these two states of mind arise from within ignorance. They're always together with ignorance. So ignorance, again, can be antidoted at the deeper level if we have the ultimate antidote to the wisdom realizing emptiness. But when we're dealing with attachment and anger specifically, we can use some antidotes that are targeted at them. For example, with regard to attachment, when we have a mind of desire, what is happening with the mind of attachment is that we're seeing something that we find attractive, and we're accentuating, exaggerating the positive qualities of it. We are experiencing something positive there. That's a given, because we wouldn't be attracted to the object if we weren't. But we take those attractive qualities, and we kind of paint the entire object with that. And we think that there are no unattractive aspects to it. And we cling to that object, we grasp at it, and we pull it towards ourselves, and we don't want to be separated from it. This is what the mind of attachment does. Well, what is the specific antidote that is taught in relation to attachment is to see the unattractive aspects of the object, to kind of make ourselves aware of other qualities that are there with the object as well, that we're blind to at that point. The mind of attachment sees only the positive, sees only what is delicious and delightful, and doesn't see all the other faults and, again, kind of the factors that are involved in that object that are not so desirable, that are not so pleasant. And it doesn't mean that we want to go to a place of aversion towards the object by only focusing on what is negative and unpleasant about it or unattractive about it. Rather, we want to balance it out so that the mind of attachment that's normally only focused on what's good happens, now to see that there are both qualities. And by virtue of that, it lessens greatly, because we see that our attachment wasn't telling us a correct story. It wasn't giving us the full view. Well, it's a similar thing in regard to anger or hatred. And let's use hatred as an example, particularly when we have hatred towards some other being, to someone who has harmed us directly, or those that we love, someone whose views are very opposed to ours. When we have the mind of hatred, we're doing the same thing in the opposite vein. It's something unpleasant we're experiencing, and we accentuate the unpleasant qualities. We think that it's totally covered with those. We don't see anything that is positive about it. Now, again, you might think, well, then the antidote is to see those positive things. But in fact, we see those positive things most clearly when we cultivate, in the case of antidoting hatred, when we cultivate the mind of love, of loving kindness. Loving kindness is looking at that being and seeing them as someone who is bereft of happiness, someone who is suffering and doesn't have all of what they desire. They lack their real, genuine happiness. So if we cultivate the mind of loving kindness towards them in the space of these thoughts of hatred and anger arising, we are actually able to completely interrupt that flow. Because you can't have these two minds present. You can't have a mind of loving kindness and concern for the well-being of another and a mind that's hateful and angry and upset at them at the same time. We may vacillate between these two, but they are antidotal. When we have a mind of loving kindness, it diminishes and eventually destroys that mind of hatred, at least it being present in the mind at the time. Again, these are called temporal antidotes, and you can have many other things you can introduce. In the traditional teachings, they talk also about meditating on impermanence. That can be a very valuable antidote with regard to attachment, because when we're attached to something, we have that desire for it to be in our lives all the time, to continue to be so delicious and delightful and wonderful. But things change. Those things that we enjoy at one time may not be as enjoyable at another time. If we keep that in mind, then that diminishes some of the unwholesome or mistaken thoughts that we might have that are present with attachment. The same with regard to anger. You can apply the antidote of impermanence there as well. Because think back on your own life, those instances in your life where you got very upset, angry, maybe even hateful towards someone else. You know that it's changed because you're probably not carrying around that hatred in the same way that you felt it at that time. Hopefully you've moved on, maybe even forgiven that person. But we see that things do change, and impermanence can be a very valuable thing to recall to undermine some of the thoughts that are behind our delusions. But there are many other antidotes that are taught. I'm not going to do a whole explanation of those. They're in the traditional Lam text, probably one of the nicest explanations of some of the antidotes to what are called the 6 root afflictions, which include those 3. In addition, it includes afflicted views, it includes afflicted doubt, and it includes pride. When you read about those, you can get a pretty broad range of things that you can use to antidote the main afflictions that arise, because all the other afflictions are derivatives of those. The best explanation I've seen is in the back of volume 2 of Geshe Sopa's Steps on the Path to Enlightenment. He has a really nice section where he goes into the various thoughts that we can introduce in our minds to antidote those afflictions. So once more, we can target them at a temporal level, having antidotes that keep specific afflictions from arising. But then we can also get them at a deeper level, an ultimate level, by coming to see the emptiness of the I, the emptiness of the other person or the object involved, the emptiness of whatever's going on in terms of an action. All of those things can be seen as lacking any inherent existence. And if we have a deep understanding of that, that can be an extremely effective tool to overcome the afflictions. But this is really our job. I may have mentioned this quote last week, or well, 3 weeks ago when I taught this course last. There's a saying from one of the great Kadampa Geshes, Geshe Ben Kongyo. I wish there was more of this on this man. I don't know much about him, but he was apparently an amazing practitioner. He had been a thief earlier in his life, and he managed to find the Dharma and to reverse a lot of his negative thinking. But one of his quotes is, he says, standing at the door of the afflictions, holding the spear of the antidotes. Other than this, I have no other job. Like this is really our job as Buddhists, is to be kind of right there in our own minds. And whenever we see an affliction begin to arise, to do something to antidote it, to do something to remove it, to lessen it. And of course it's advisable to start with those that are more prominent in our minds. If you have a lot of problem or difficulty with jealousy, for example, or for pride, what have you, then maybe that's the one that you start on, because your success there will have a ripple effect in terms of working with the other delusions. Plus, it's the one that's probably causing you the most harm, as well as others the most harm. So if you target that one in particular and you say, okay, I'm going to really work on this affliction so that I can remove it once and for all, and really make some strong concerted effort. Well, you aren't removing it completely until you have the ultimate antidote, but you can lessen it greatly. And then you feel good that you've made some progress. And then you can begin to work on the others. But yeah, usually for most of us, it's really trying to make sure we diminish those that we find most harmful to ourselves or others, that are most prominent in our minds. And then we can work on the other delusions as we continue our spiritual path. This verse was once more making that determination to have this courage, this conviction that says, okay, this is my job now. This is what I need to do. Just in the same way that all these people can be dedicated to doing something to retaliate when they've been harmed, I'm going to have the same dedication to doing what I can to get rid of these afflictions, to destroy them, to make sure that we do everything possible to keep them from arising. So I don't know if I need to say much more on that. There was maybe more than what I needed to say, but I thought it was useful to touch on the antidotes there, at least to introduce that concept. We're now entering into another part of that section. Let's go ahead and do the share back on this slide. After this verse 36, we go back then to this main topic that we were looking at. This was, again, the third of the trainings that we need to be conscientious with regard to conscientiously abandoning the afflictions. The second outline now, the first one having been, again, that how it is, let's see if I can find that. Where was that? Oh, back here, contemplating the faults of the afflictions. Now we're going into the second outline, which is how it is unsuitable to tire of the difficulty of abandoning the afflictions, how it's not suitable for us to be lax, for us to sit back and be indolent and let the afflictions run their course. You know, Venerable Rabina Corton, who I'm sure you know, she teaches on these different states of the mind. She calls them your crazy roommates. Like, you know, if you've got you yourself in this room that is your room of your mind, you've got all these crazy roommates that are hanging out there. We have to be really attentive to and not tire of trying to work against them, to do what we can to abandon them, to do what we can to offset what they are doing to our minds. So this has three different outlines, and again, I'll only be able to put these up there one at a time. The first outline is making the determination that one is able to destroy the afflictions, and it continues in our Gyaltsep Je's commentary, and it is unsuitable to tire of the difficulties. So making the determination that we're able to destroy them, that we actually have the ability to do that, and therefore it's unsuitable to tire, because if we continue to put the energy into it, they will eventually be overcome. So this has two verses that are associated with it. The first one is verse 37. Master Shantideva says, "If at the time of a violent battle, vigorously desiring to conquer those afflicted ones who are naturally subject to suffering through death, men, disregarding the pain of being pierced by spears and arrows, do not withdraw until the goal is accomplished, then what need to mention that I should not despair and be indolent, even if I am caused many hundreds of sufferings, when now I strive to definitely overcome my natural enemies that are the constant cause of all my suffering." So he uses another analogy here, which, again, you have to keep in mind that this was, we live in times where there's war and battle and all these things. They still exist in our world. But this was very much a part of the terrain of India at the time of Master Shantideva and the Buddha, was, you know, this idea of training to go into battle to fight one's enemies. And we do see that in worldly terms, this happens where people are strongly determined to crush the enemy, to do what they can to destroy the enemy so that the enemy doesn't arise again. And they put great efforts into that. So he uses a wartime example as an example for how we need to work with our minds, to have that determination, because we see that we can, through the force of our, you know, making battle against the afflictions, even if we have to endure many things, just like in battle you have to deal with being pierced by arrows and spears and other things, until the purpose is achieved, until you've actually gotten rid of the enemy, you're going to make effort. You're going to continue to not be tired, to not be indolent in the face of that. So there's just a little bit of commentary in Gyaltsep Je for this that I'm going to refer to. He says here, "The afflicted ones, whose nature it is anyway to transform to the suffering of death, even without being killed, are the object of compassion." So he's just saying that this is who we're talking about, is the beings who are unfortunately under the control of their afflictions, and they suffer anyway. They're all going to die, but they make great strides in order to protect themselves and others in battle. So he says, when those beings are doing battle with the strong will to fight and to overcome the enemy, They will disregard the suffering inflicted by weapons such as arrows, spears, and so forth, and will not retreat until their aim is achieved. So, again, using that as an example, what need is there to mention that it is appropriate for the yogi wishing to destroy the enemy of the afflictions, who has treated us as an enemy from the day of our birth, to therefore not give up striving to destroy this enemy, and to not give in to despondency and laziness despite hundredfold suffering such as cold, hunger, and thirst. Of course, again, the struggles that we have to do on the path sometimes do involve physical austerities. It's not to be denied that we do have to have some willingness to endure some things that might be a little bit uncomfortable. But I would say probably one of the most kind of suffering things we have to endure is to kind of work on our own minds, to move against this ego that is clinging so tightly to wanting things to continue to go the same way. We have to make great strides and great effort to kind of push against that. And of course, that's at the root of all of our afflictions, all of our delusions. So it does take this determination that's being described in this verse, to be able to continue to be committed to this path of destroying the afflictions, regardless of what we have to experience. I'm reminded of a story His Holiness the Dalai Lama told. It was at a teaching that I had the good fortune of attending in, I think it was the one at UCLA in 1997, teachings that he was giving on Nagarjuna's text, Precious Garland. And he had a Q&A thing, which of course is normal for His Holiness to answer questions in the audience. And he picked up or I guess it was Jinjimpa, his translator, who picked up the piece of paper and read to His Holiness saying, Your Holiness, what is the quickest, easiest way to become enlightened? And His Holiness, there was a lot of laughter in the hall, and His Holiness began to answer. And then he stopped and he started weeping and was just there in tears, and the whole place went silent. And His Holiness eventually started speaking Tibetan to Thupten Jinpa, and Thupten Jinpa translated. And what His Holiness shared from that question was, he said it reminded him of the story of Milarepa. And towards the very end of Milarepa's life, when he had students who he had been working with, he called them all to a meeting the next day. He said, I want you all to come here, and I want to give you a teaching. And so all of them were thinking, oh wow, he's going to give us this, like, the real stuff. He's going to give us some secret teaching that we're going to be able to become enlightened overnight or something. And so they all arrive there that morning for the teaching from Milarepa, and all that he does is he stands up, he lifts up his robe and shows his backside that's completely calloused from all of the meditation that he's had to do, from all of the sitting, all the hard work that he's had to engage in. And so His Holiness kind of waved his finger and he said, don't think easy, don't think quick, think long term. And so why I shared that story again is because it shows that you do have to endure some difficulties. This isn't like a path where you can just overnight, achieve these great realizations. Most of us, again, have been working on this for decades now, but decades are nothing when you compare it to the countless lives that we've had where we've been under the control of all these factors. So recognize that this is a path that does involve some suffering. So we have to have that determination that Master Shantideva is saying there, to be willing to overcome and destroy the afflictions, because we understand that that will eventually ensue if we put all the dedicated practice into it. So there is one verse that I thought I'd share from the other commentary that I refer to occasionally, which is one that was translated by my classmate from the master's program, Ziggy To, and it's also called Precious Garland, but it's a commentary on Shantideva's text by the abbot Dragpa Gyaltsen. He quotes in there from Aryasura's Garland of Birth Stories, the Jataka Mala, and in that there's just a 3-line verse. It says, "Discouragement does not help one become free from deprivation. Therefore, if your mind is uplifted by courage, you have in your hand the accomplishment of all goals." So if we kind of stay discouraged and, we're never going to overcome the deprivation that we are involved in, the continual control of the afflictions on our own minds. If we have courage, we will. We have in our hands, as he says here, the accomplishment of all goals. So I think it's important that we hear these kinds of verses. And once more, I may mention this again at the end of our class tonight, but I think it's really important that we meditate on these verses as we're going through them. And this can be a wonderful one to induce that strong determination at the beginning of our day, perhaps, that we're going to do everything that we can to be like Geshe Ben Kongyo says, to hold the spear of the antidotes, just waiting for an affliction to arise and to immediately apply it. We have to have some of that motivation to do that. So let's go back then to the slides and continue with the next few verses. The second outline, once more, that we're in is about how it's unsuitable to tire. The second outline, that, again, it had 3 outlines, I believe, is the benefits of striving to destroy the afflictions. So this has kind of a number of verses involved in it. So within that outline, the benefits of striving to destroy the afflictions, we have 3 more outlines. The very first of these is, being the cause for one's welfare, austerities are suitable to bear. That is completely suitable for us to endure what we might have to do in fighting the afflictions. This is verse 39. Master Shantideva says, if even scars inflicted by meaningless enemies are worn upon the body like ornaments, then why is suffering a cause of harm to me, who impeccably strives to fulfill the great purpose? So this idea, when I first read this verse, it reminded me of a book I read in grade school. Maybe you read it too, Stephen Crane's The Red Badge of Courage. It's kind of like this book where it's all about the Civil War and about the enduring these great pains and sufferings as part of battle, which is kind of what this is saying. He says here, that people endure these things and wear these badges of honor, of courage. And they've done that for no purpose, really. Nothing that commendable. All they've done is engage in negative karma generally by harming the lives of other beings. But they wear these badges of courage out of their own valor in doing that. Well, why shouldn't we have similar kinds of abilities to endure these things and to even sort of, wear them as badges of our own courage, ways of acknowledging our own attempts to overcome the afflictions, the delusions. So there's not too much in Gyaltsepje's commentary on that. He says, worldly beings sustain scars for no purpose at all and wear them like ornaments, saying, this scar I got at such and such a time. They kind of boast about it. Even you might see that in athletics to some degree, when people boast about how they endured various things and had to break a leg or do whatever, to overcome these various challenges in their training. I don't know. I don't do so much of that myself. So then he goes on and it says, okay, if that's the case, then why would one then be harmed by the sufferings endured while striving stridently in the austerities? Those austerities are to achieve the great purpose of complete enlightenment. So if we've got a much greater goal, and again, the goals that were talked about in terms of the wartime stuff are worldly goals that are actually non-virtuous. We've got a virtuous goal. We've got something we're striving for to achieve for the sake of all sentient beings. Well, then how much more we should be happy to endure austerities. Not that we're going to go bragging about them and kind of wearing them, so that people can see all the stuff that we've had to endure, but we shouldn't have any problem enduring them. We definitely should, rejoice in the goal that we're trying to achieve and be willing to endure whatever it takes to get there. So we'll go back once more and continue with the second of the 3 outlines here. The second outline within this around the benefits of striving to destroy the afflictions is, being the cause for others' welfare, austerities are suitable to bear. So the first one, if we go back to that again, we saw that it was in terms of one's own welfare. So because, we are able to achieve enlightenment, well, then it's good for us to endure these. But this next verse has to do with the fact that, we're also going to endure these for the welfare of others. So here Shantideva says, if fishermen, outcasts, farmers, and so forth, thinking merely of their own livelihood, endure the harms of heat and cold, why do I not endure them for the sake of the happiness of migrating beings? So once more, we have that challenge to us that if we see in the world around us that people endure all kinds of things on the basis of the first one, kind of more worldly goals and what have you, the second verse that we looked at in terms of one's own welfare, well, we're dedicated, if we're following this path genuinely, to the welfare of all beings. We're dedicated to achieving enlightenment so we can help each and every single one of them. Well, we should have even greater determination and courage to endure things, because our goal is much greater than just one's own food on one's plate and keeping one's own family alive and what have you. These are noble things in their own way, I suppose, but they're not a final goal. They're not something that will actually help the countless other beings that exist. So again, the commentary is very similar here. He says, fishers, outcasts, farmers, and the like kill fish, do lowly work, work on the fields, and so forth, and are bearing difficulties like cold or heat and such, all this solely with the thought of their own livelihood. If that is so, then why can one not bear similar sufferings to accomplish the happiness of all migrators? It would be appropriate to bear them. So once more, if we have a much greater goal, many more that will benefit from our actions by virtue of being dedicated to the welfare of all beings, it makes more sense that we would have greater fortitude in overcoming any of these obstacles, bearing all these austerities, what have you. So the very next outline, the third outline in regard to this second topic within this outline, is why one needs to complete the earlier given promise. Having made the promise prior to dedicated welfare of all beings that we saw when we looked at the mind of bodhicitta in the first chapter and so on. This is, important that we complete this promise, that we not let this promise go unfulfilled. So this is the first verses 41 and then the first two lines of verse 42. Here Shantideva says, when I promised to liberate migrating beings, dwelling in the 10 directions, as far as the ends of space from their afflictions, I myself was not yet freed from the afflictions. Thus, unaware of even my own capacity, was it not somewhat crazy to have spoken like that? This is an interesting verse. I mean, the way it's worded almost makes it sound like, somehow it is sort of crazy for us to make this type of a commitment when we ourselves haven't even gotten liberated from our own suffering. We're making that promise to be dedicated to helping all sentient beings to be free from their suffering. And we're still in that state of suffering. It's kind of like, again, I sometimes use the analogy of a pool of quicksand. If we were in that pool of quicksand with a number of other people, what would be kind of like standing, or well, not quite standing up, but yelling out to everyone else saying, I'm going to free you all from this pool of quicksand while you still are in the quicksand. It's like, good luck with that. We're not going to have much ability while we're still stuck in it to get people out of it. Well, it's a similar type of thing that we're doing here. Another way of kind of looking at this verse, though, is the recognition that in order to accomplish that, in order to liberate other beings, we do have to do the work on ourselves. This is what I mentioned earlier is, that the Bodhisattva, even though I think I touched on this in a previous class, even though the Bodhisattva is intent upon achieving Buddhahood, enlightenment, as opposed to that Bodhisattva's own liberation, the Bodhisattva still has to go through the path that removes all of what causes oneself to suffer first. Recall that there are two sets of afflictions, or I'm sorry, obscurations. Obscurations being those things that are blocking our minds from achieving certain states. The first level of obscurations are the afflictive obscurations. And those on the Hinayana path, those who are practicing, desiring their own individual liberation, they have to remove all of those in order to achieve that state of nirvana, in order to achieve that peace that comes with that result. So that first level of afflictive obscurations is part of the path. It's not the main one for the Bodhisattva, though. For the Bodhisattva, it's the second set of obscurations that is problematic. Those are called the obscurations to omniscience, the obscurations to liberation that are the afflictions. This is a deeper obscuration and a much subtler obscuration that exists in the mind. The obscurations to omniscience, or the knowledge obscurations or obstructions as they're sometimes called, are an imprint in the mind from having had the conception of true existence, inherent existence since beginningless time. We've had that ignorance. That ignorance has left a residue in the mind. They often compare this to a clay pot that we have kept garlic in. And so the first step is to remove the garlic, which are the afflictive obscurations. But then when you smell the pot, after having held those cloves of garlic for so long, it still has the stain, the residue of that. It still smells a bit like garlic. So we have these stains in our minds that are the subtler obscurations. They say those are what keep you from having an unbounded mind. They keep you in a dualistic perspective with that dualistic appearance. They give rise to this false appearance that things exist on their own out there. So the first practice that the Bodhisattva has to go through is to generate the wisdom of emptiness, to remove all of those afflictive obscurations, to remove the garlic from the pot. After having removed the garlic, then the Bodhisattva continues to do the deeper work to remove even these subtler stains. So this is an important part of this verse too, is to recognize that while one might say that and say, well, but my job is to remove the afflictions of all these beings, and to do that I have to become a Buddha, therefore I have to remove the obstructions to my omniscience. Well, you can't get to those without having practiced the path that removes the afflictive obscurations. So this is what's being said in Gyaltsepje's commentary on this verse and a half. He says, arguments being set forward. One has made the promise to destroy the afflictions in the continuum of others, and it is unsuitable to strive in destroying the afflictions in one's own continuum, because one would fall into the extreme of peace. In other words, if I do that work, then perhaps there's another angle we can look at too, which is then maybe I'll fall into solitary peace. I won't have the stamina, the determination to help other beings. But the answer that's given says, if at the time when one generated the mind and made the promise to liberate all migrators, equaling the expanse of space from their afflictions, oneself is not free at that time from the afflictions, then not to mention the welfare of others, one cannot achieve even one's own welfare. So he kind of gives forward that answer, which says, well, yes, I suppose there is that danger that if someone solely focused on their own afflictive obscurations, they could fall into that extreme of solitary peace. But the reality is that if we are really genuine in our desire to benefit other beings, we have to work on removing our own afflictions. We have to get more qualified to be able to help others, which means removing what is obscuring our own minds, not just the second level of the obscurations, but the first level. So then he continues, he says, being under the control of the afflictions, one does not know one's own measure. How can one say that one will liberate others from their afflictions? So how can we say that we'll do that if we haven't worked on our own afflictions? That's more the folly, if we really want to talk about it being crazy. It is sort of crazy to think that somehow we're going to be able to help others without having done the work on ourselves. Again, if we look at what bodhicitta is all about, it's essentially that mind that indicates very clearly that we have to become more qualified to help others more genuinely. It's not to say that we can't help them right now. We can, and especially during the times, everything that's going on in the world, it's good if we can help. It's good if we can be there on the ground, helping beings in the moment. But we need to help them so much more than that. Because until they all are free of these afflictive obscurations, and certainly even free then of the knowledge obscurations, they're not going to be in their final state, in their state of complete totality, their complete well-being, which is the state of Buddhahood. So it is a little crazy, as he's saying here. Was it not crazy for us to kind of make some determination to help other sentient beings in this way when we haven't even done the work on ourselves? I sometimes use, maybe I even said this previously, or possibly when I was in New York in October last year teaching on the first 3 chapters, I sometimes compare this example of bodhicitta to, let's say, a young girl who is touched in her family by having many people who have experienced cancer, who maybe have died from cancer or are suffering from it. And so she sees this suffering that's going on in her life. And she decides at a very young age that she wants to help people with cancer. She wants to become an oncologist or a cancer researcher, or do something really meaningful with her life in that way, because she's moved by the suffering that she's seen. Well, at the young age that she's at, when she's still in grade school, or maybe even earlier than that, and she makes that determination, it sounds kind of foolish then, right at that point. I mean, she can't go around at 6, 7 years old and saying, I'm helping to relieve the cancer of sentient beings, or I'm helping to make sure that there are cures for cancer in the future. Well, you aren't able to do that yet. That young girl has to go through all of the schooling, through grade school, through high school, through university and medical school, do all the things that are necessary after medical school, through interning, through becoming a researcher if that's what she's going to do. Once she gets fully qualified, then yes, she's fully dedicated to doing it. But prior to that, it's more of, again, an aspiration without the real means to do it. So again, everything that she does with that motivation helps her to become more qualified. But until she's qualified, she really doesn't have the ability to help others to that great degree. So in some ways, we look at this verse and we can think the same thing. Each of us, it's a little bit crazy when we say, well, I'm going to dedicate my life to removing the suffering of all sentient beings, and I'm still in a suffering state. It looks a little bit crazy. And if I were to achieve that removal of my own suffering by virtue of removing my afflictions, it's not the final goal for me even. I still have to go on to the advanced practices that help me to actually attain the state of Buddhahood, to go beyond just my own freedom from suffering and to actually help others by becoming fully enlightened for their sake. So the last little bit of this commentary, it says, if one is bound by cyclic existence, one cannot complete the welfare of others. And therefore, one should strive to abandon the afflictions in one's continuum. There's nothing wrong with that motivation, to say, I want to be free of all of my afflictions. Why? Because it helps me become more qualified to help others. Again, we are not doing it with the motivation of a Hinayana practitioner saying, I just want to check out a samsara, kind of leave everyone behind and go off into my solitary peace. Rather, we are dedicating our work on our own afflictions to the welfare of all sentient beings. So this is, again, a way to interpret this verse, to kind of see it from that point of view of what levels of obscurations we're really out to achieve, but nonetheless, how we still have to get rid of all the obscurations, or else we won't be able to benefit others. So in terms of then the next outline, going back to the slides, we then have the third outline within this larger outline of, again, being unsuitable to tire of the difficulty of the affliction. This third outline says it is appropriate to strive in the trainings that destroy the afflictions. So a lot of similar messages, but again, just maybe a slightly different orientation on some of these. This third outline within that has two outlines. The very first one is the advice to strive in the antidote to the afflictions. Once more, kind of going back to that idea that therefore we have to put great effort into doing everything we can to as a countermeasure to the afflictions. This is in two parts. The first is with verse 42, the last two lines, and then verse 43. So the first part of it says, since this is the case, what we just looked at, I should never withdraw from vanquishing the afflictions. So this is a very powerful statement, again, that we want to affirm that, since this is the case, that we actually have to put this energy into it so we can become better qualified to benefit others, then I should never withdraw from doing what I can to counteract the afflictions. I shall adhere to this, and resenting them, I shall meet them in battle. But afflictions such as these types destroy afflictions and are not included. Kind of a weird statement there. Let me go back to that. Sorry. So what he says is that essentially those first two lines are that strong determination that it's suitable to abandon the afflictions, and so we have to continue to be dedicated to that, to never withdraw or reverse that thought, and do everything we can to abandon them. So then it says, I shall adhere to this, meaning that, again, we shall be dedicated to continuing to practice the antidotes, to destroy the afflictions by meeting them in battle with a vengeance, with this resentment, as it says, resenting them, having this desire to destroy them. I shall meet them in battle. With these last two lines of verse 43 are kind of indicating that somebody might look at that and say, well, that sounds like a delusion. It sounds like you're, with your resentment and your vengeance towards the afflictions, that's actually not such a harmful state or helpful state of mind. It's actually a harmful one. So in regard to that, Gyaltsab says, that which is to be abandoned and the antidote are attachment and anger, and revenge for that to be abandoned is an affliction and therefore to be abandoned to. This is what somebody could put forward, an argument from somebody saying, well, you know, yeah, you're trying to abandon these delusions like anger and attachment and what have you, but what you're putting out there is an equal affliction. It's like revenge, and you know, sometimes we even use this phrase of being angry at the afflictions. You know, that I can have anger towards my anger, which sounds a little strange, but the idea here is that when we have that real deep-seated desire to annihilate the afflictions, that's not a delusion. So the answer that's given from Gyaltsab, he says, holding on to the antidote and the anger at that which is to be abandoned appear like afflictions, but actually belong to the side of the antidote that destroys the afflictions. They are not contained in that to be abandoned. So this is on, I haven't been mentioning page numbers of Gyaltsab's commentary. I apologize for that. We're on page 25 right now. But this is, again, maybe not such a big point, but anytime we have kind of an anger towards the afflictions, like even when we have anger at someone else, it's kind of interesting, right? We get upset at them. We're going to see this in chapter 6 when we get to it. Master Shantideva says, if someone's beating you with a stick, well, you get angry at the person, not the stick, right? You know, if someone were to suggest, well, you're supposed to be angry at the stick because the stick is what's hurting you. The stick is what's hitting you in the head. Well, we always say, but we get angry at the person. And why? What's the logic? Because the person is wielding the stick. The stick is kind of under the control of the person. Well, Master Shantideva says, if you look at it more deeply, you actually see that the person who's wielding the stick is also under the control of another factor, namely their own delusions. So if he suggests in that chapter, well then, if you're going to get angry at anything, get angry at the delusions in the mind of that person who's wielding the stick. Don't get angry at the person, because the person is also under the control of these other factors. So here, if we recognize that anger is the real thing that we are out to annihilate, the anger in the mind of that person who's harming you, or the anger in our own mind that causes us to retaliate, we want to support within that an anger at the afflictions, an anger at our own anger, an anger at the anger of the other person. I mean, it sounds strange to use that wording, but we always want to do whatever we can to destroy the afflictions, whether they be in another person's mind or in our own minds. We see that as the enemy. The person isn't the enemy. The anger in their mind is the enemy. We aren't the enemy. We shouldn't feel, negative thoughts towards ourselves. We just isolate that part of our mind that is thinking incorrectly, that is inducing these angry thoughts, and we make that the enemy. And we have anger towards it. We fight it to a great degree. Again, not with a mind of anger that is deluded, with a mind that is intent upon seeking our revenge, taking all the steps that we need to remove it. So this was that verse, the couple of verse and a half again that went into that idea of striving against the afflictions by generating these antidotes. And then we have the second outline. Strive, this is the advice from Master Shantideva, to strive to never let the mind fall under the control of the afflictions. And this is verse 44. He says, I would rather be burned and killed and even have my head cut off than to ever bow down to the enemy that is the afflictions in any way. So this is, again, a very powerful statement that we can meditate on in terms of inducing that kind of strong determination and intention, that we would even endure all kinds of other pains rather than succumb to the afflictions. It's hard to imagine. I mean, again, if we were in really, really difficult situation where someone was coming at us in a very angry way, threatening us physically to cause great harm to our bodies, we're not saying you don't try to avoid that. His Holiness the Dalai Lama always says the best thing in a situation like that is to run away. But if we can't run away, we're confronted with that. If we do anything to harm that person, don't do it with anger. Don't do it with kind of a mind that is the same sort of mindset that's coming at you. Be willing to endure whatever it takes to not let the mind go to anger. If we have to get injured in the process of doing that, that's again a really tall order, but we would do that rather than succumb to the afflictions, rather than having those moments of anger. Well, what's the logic for that? The logic for that is that while we will suffer in the moment if we have to be beaten by that person or injured by that person, that harm to us is nothing compared to what will ensue karmically if we buy into the mind of anger. If we do something to retaliate against them out of a very spiteful, angry mind, we're going to create unbelievable karma for suffering in our future. So in the Gyaltsabje's commentary, again on page 25, there's a question put forward. It says, is it not better to follow the afflictions, since to abandon the afflictions brings hundreds of sufferings with it? You know, is it not better to just kind of go with the flow and get angry at the person and keep them from harming you? Because otherwise we're going to have all that suffering that would ensue from having to endure the pain from that person. The answer is given regardless of whether one dies by being burnt or whether one is decapitated. It is still easy. That is easy comparatively, because at that time one is only separated from life. One loses one's life. Of course, we value our life so much, right? This is what's going on in the world around us to a large degree too. I'm not saying that people aren't being selfless and caring for others, but a lot of it is very much self-motivated. I need to protect myself at whatever cost. I even was reading something on the news about things starting to happen in stores where people are fighting over things and threatening each other with all kinds of violence. Well, that's very much a selfish mind that, you know, if even if we were to have some harm at that time, that's only within this one life. But we can't see it at that time because we're clinging so tightly to this life, clinging so tightly to our own welfare right now. So the answer continues from Gyaltsab-je. He says, but one should never submit to the enemy of the afflictions that causes us to take rebirth in the lower realms and is an obstacle to attaining our wishes. We should never fall under their control. Once more, because this is going to lead to more severe consequences. Every time we give into the afflictions, we strengthen them. Every time they get strengthened, they become a pattern that we fall into more and more frequently, more and more easily. So we have to be very vigilant in attending to the afflictions and making sure that we do everything we can to not allow them to arise, even in the face of great suffering that we might have to endure. I found one little verse or passage from Pema Chodron. Again, on your reading list for this course is the book. It was originally published as No Time to Lose. Of course, it's showing in reverse there on my screen. I think these cameras, the camera I have kind of reverses the image sometimes. But anyway, this has been published as what is it called? Something Becoming Bodhisattvas or something. I can't remember what they republished it as. This is page 99, page 99, where she has this little comment. She says, as the years go by, I understand this kind of passionate determination and confidence more and more. The choice is mine. I can spend my life strengthening my kleshas, my afflictions, or I can weaken them. I can continue to be their slave, or, realizing they're not solid, I can simply accept them as my own powerful yet ineffable energy. It's increasingly clear which choice leads to further pain and which one leads to relaxation and delight. So she talks a little bit about them being kind of this in having nothing solid, but kind of our own energy. This even hints a bit at what the tantric path is about, which is kind of harnessing the energy of these afflictions. But this is all that's happening, is that our mind is moving energy in a particular direction. We can change that. We can alter that. It's our choice whether we want to do that. Do we want to continue to be the servant of the afflictions and let the afflictions just continue to rule the day and be in charge of the show? Or do we want to do everything we can to get them out of that position, to put ourselves in charge in terms of knowing what's best for our own welfare and for the welfare of others? So that was the total of this section B. It had 3 outlines, again, about how it's unsuitable to tire of the difficulty of abandoning the afflictions. Let me pause there before I continue. It's about quarter to the end of the class, about 15 minutes. And I usually like to at least see if there are any questions or comments. Again, you're welcome to unmute your mic if you'd like to ask a question, or you can put something in the chat box. But if I don't get any questions, then I certainly will continue on, and maybe we can, I don't know if we can finish this chapter tonight. I think we may be able to. I was hoping to finish it tonight so we could move on to chapter 5. Okay, well then let's go ahead and go back to the slides. And we enter into the third outline within this topic of abandoning the afflictions. Once more, we were just on the one abandoning afflictions in terms of how it's unsuitable, tired of the difficulty of abandoning them. Now we're in the final of the three outlines under this, which is meditating on enthusiasm. Because if one makes an effort, one can abandon the afflictions. This is kind of pointing to the fact that if we do make this determination to overcome them, they actually can be overcome. As we're going to see, there's a verse about how they're not like worldly enemies that can resurface, like what happened with, when the United States decided to go into parts of the Middle East to combat Al Qaeda and what have you, and like they may not, we may have gotten rid of some people that were involved in that by doing that, those actions that the army engaged in and what have you, but things just keep arising. Our enemies keep appearing in different forms, and now there's still, ISIS and the Taliban and all these other people that are basically doing the same sort of things. The enemy on the outside is much harder to defeat, but the enemy on the inside, while it does take great effort, can be abandoned completely, can be gotten rid of so that we never have to experience that enemy again. The first outline is once the afflictions are dispelled from one's continuum, they have no place to go. So this is that idea of kind of like they can't take up root in another country in another part of the world and cause more mayhem. So ordinary enemies, Master Shantideva says, when they are expelled from one country, simply settle down in another and embrace it. And when their capability is recovered, they then return. They kind of strengthen their forces, and then they eventually come back with a vengeance. But the way of this enemy, my afflictions, is different. So, in regard to this verse, Gyaltsab says, I think it's pretty straightforward. We don't have to spend a lot of time on it, but he brings forth someone who could make, again, a statement of some objection, raising a point. He says, someone says, afflictions are like worldly enemies in that after having been expelled from one place, they find again strength and harm again. So it is appropriate to treat them likewise. So this is somebody who isn't understanding the nature of the Buddhist path and the ability to completely remove the afflictions, and is saying, well, these afflictions, they're the enemies, but they're just like our external enemies. If we defeat them in one place, defeat them in Iraq, well, then they scatter out to the other countries, and all of a sudden they're rising up in Syria, and they're rising up in Afghanistan, and they're rising, use a worldly example. So again, this is how this person is seeing it, is saying, well, there's a possibility that that's what's actually happening here. And the answer that Gyaltsab gives is, it's not the same. When the ordinary enemy gets expelled from one place, they conquer another place, regain their strength there, and then return to take their revenge. The way of the enemy of the afflictions is not like that. Once they have been expelled from the root, they cannot remain in another place, and they cannot return. Of course, this is the promise that the Buddha made by teaching the Four Noble Truths, right? When he came up with the third noble truth, having set out that our situation is this state of dukkha, this dissatisfactory, unsatisfactory existence that we have, that there are causes to it. It arises on the basis of karma and delusions and so on. And then the third noble truth, that we can have an end to this state. We no longer will experience dukkha. There can be a complete cessation of that if we practice the path, the fourth noble truth. And so there's this idea in the Four Noble Truths that you can actually expel the enemy once and for all, that you don't have to experience any suffering once you have completely removed the causes of that. So the causes of that are capable of being totally overcome, so that they don't just go to some other part of our mind or some other place and then arise again later. They don't have that capacity once we have done the deeper work to destroy them. So let's go on then to the second of the three outlines, where we continue this exploration of why it's good to put enthusiasm into our practice, because we can overcome the delusions. This is the second outline that says if one makes an effort, they can be abandoned because they arise from a mistaken cause. Of course, this is the gist of them, is that if they had something that was grounded in truth, in reality, they couldn't be uprooted because they would be in accord with how things actually exist. But because they have a fictitious object that they are clinging to, they are not in line with truth at all. They can therefore be removed. So this verse, Master Shantideva says, afflictions, when abandoned by the wisdom and dispelled from my mind, where will you go? Where will you dwell and return to harm me? Although this is so weak-minded, I have been reduced to making no effort. So in those first 3 lines, he's kind of saying the truth of it, that there is no place for the afflictions to go to. They don't hang out in some other corner of the mind after we've done some work to remove them, the deeper work that is, again, the realization of emptiness. They will be gone. And that last line, although this is so, although I know this, although I've heard this, although I've got teachings on this, although the Buddha said it in the Four Noble Truths, myself, being weak-minded, have made no effort into this. I haven't really put all my money on doing that work. So again, I'll just read a little bit of what Gyaltsab Je says. He says, once the afflictions have been abandoned from the root, they have no other base. Since the afflictions arise from a faulty root, one should strive to abandon them with the eye of wisdom that realizes emptiness. So my teacher over in Italy, when he was commenting on this, went into a whole description of the root of suffering, which is, when we generally use the word ignorance, but it's a very specific form of ignorance. It really is causing the whole circling in cyclic existence. When we talk about the 12 links, there's the first link of ignorance. That ignorance that starts the whole process of these 12 links is what's called the view of the transitory collection. It's a view where we look at the I, the sense of self that we designate to this collection of stuff, and we think that it exists intrinsically. We overlayer a fictitious idea with regard to this I. We think the I has some sort of substantial, real existence. On the basis of that, everything else follows. All of our suffering follows. So why my teacher went into that is, again, that's a faulty state of mind. That's not a mind that is grounded in reality. It is taking something that is observing, which is the I that is imputed on this collection, this transitory collection of body and mind, and it's elevating its status beyond what is actually there. It's thinking that the I has that measure of existence when it doesn't possess that at all. So it is a fictitious mind. It is a mind that is believing in something that is not real. I sometimes use the example of a child who is convinced that there's a monster in the room and is having difficulty sleeping because it's absolutely certain that there must be a monster somewhere in the room. Well, that child's inducing all of his or her own suffering on the basis of a mistaken conception, believing in something that isn't really there. And of course, what will overcome that is the wisdom of knowing that there is no monster in the room, the thing that refutes that mistaken idea. So the parent will go into the room with a flashlight and shine the flashlight under the bed and shine the flashlight into all the corners of the room, into the closet, into wherever there might be a monster, and show the child. And gradually over time, the child will become convinced that this monster that they believed in doesn't exist at all. So once that is removed, then that misconception cannot take root again. And of course, this is the deeper work that we do on our path when we realize emptiness directly, when we actually become sort of transformed mentally by uprooting that ignorance so that it will never occur again, because we know that truth at the deepest possible level. So he continues, Gyaltsab Je continues, he says, once they are cleared, or what is called abandoned from the mind, where will they go and find new strength to return and retaliate? It is impossible. Although it is like this, the weak mind does not let me strive to uproot them once and for all. Our minds have a lot of power. Our ego has a lot of power. It doesn't want to necessarily be uprooted. It doesn't want to, admit defeat and leave. So one verse that my teacher cited, well, this is actually part of the other text by Abbot Drokpa Gyaltsen, but this is a verse that my teacher was commenting on a lot when he went into this. It's from Chandrakirti's text, the supplement to the Middle Way, the Madhyamakavatara, and it's verse 120 of chapter 6. This is a translation of that verse. Having seen with their mind that afflictions and faults will all arise from the view of the transitory collection without exception, and realized that its object is the self, meaning this erroneous self, the yogi or yogini, whoever it is that's practicing, then refutes the self. So having seen that all of our problems, all of our difficulties are arising from a mistaken idea, our belief in a monster, a self that doesn't exist in the way that it actually does. We have fabricated this since beginningless time. What we have to meditate on is the refutation of that self, the negation of that self. That is what we'll get into eventually when we get to chapter 9. I hope we have the good fortune to, make it to chapter 9 to discuss the teachings on emptiness that are set out there. So that's perhaps enough on that. Let me see again if we can go a little bit further tonight before we conclude just a few minutes. The next, the third outline, the final outline, this topic of getting this enthusiasm, putting dedication into practicing the path and abandoning the afflictions, is called, if they are abandoned from the root, the afflictions, cannot remain anywhere else. They are suitable to abandon. They are absolutely, it's proper for us to abandon them, because once they're gone for good. So the first two lines of this verse, it actually is the translation that's on your copy that you have with that Ziggy also did of the root verses. It's a little bit longer than what some of the other translations are. It says, if these afflictions do not abide within objects, not in the collection of sense powers, between those two, or elsewhere, then where do they abide, and how do they harm all migrating beings? They are like an illusion. Thus I should dispel the fear within my heart and strive for the sake of wisdom. For no meaning, why am I harmed in hell, and so forth. I mean, that last line is essentially, for no good reason. Why are we continuing to go through all this harm to ourselves, and certainly, seeing others go through it? When these afflictions are like an illusion, they're as transitory and unreal as everything else in reality, everything else that exists. So we should be making great efforts and striving to overcome them. So here, Gyaltsab says, puts forward an argument that once more is from an opponent, an imaginary opponent, that says, since the afflictions are generated from one's own continuum and exist inherently, they cannot be abandoned. Kind of saying, well, they're a part of our being. That you've got those afflictions kind of within you, and they're going to be a part of the situation no matter what you do. And they're inherently. Of course, this is totally contrary to what is taught by the Buddha at this level of the teachings on emptiness. But it's kind of making this assumption that if that's the case, well, then you can't abandon them. Well, the answer that Gyaltsab gives is, of course, the afflictions don't remain, based on what Shantideva said, in the objects. You usually have three things involved in any awareness: the consciousness that is knowing the object itself, and what is empowering you to know it, what we call the sense power, which in regard to, like, our eyes, we could say is something within our eyeball that allows us to receive that data and to know that object, the shape, the color of that object, and so on. And then we have, of course, a consciousness that arises when that sense power is due to being empowered to that object, knows that object. Anyway, I won't go into all the details on that, but essentially this is somebody coming forward and saying, well, it might be within the object, it might be within the sense power, so therefore we kind of have it with us all the time. Well, it can't be in the object. Shantideva, or Gyaltsab says, the afflictions can't remain in the objects of form and so on, because in this case, even arhats, even those who've gotten rid of their ignorance, would generate afflictions when they see forms, because the form would be there and it already contains the delusion that there's something attractive about the object that induces attachment, whether we have the causes for that in our own minds or not. It also is not in the sense power. He says here, they also do not remain in the collections of the sense powers of the eyes and so forth, because when one contemplates the meaning of the mode of abiding, the eyes exist, but the afflictions do not. So when one is actually generating the wisdom of emptiness, your eyes are operative, you're kind of there with your eye sense power, but your eye, you don't have an appearance of that object being inherently existent. You don't see the truth of that. So he's kind of pointing that with regard to, if we remove it from the consciousness, it doesn't reside somehow in the object. It doesn't reside somehow in the sense power. The attachment, the afflictions are solely in the consciousness. Moreover, they are caused by various factors within the consciousness, especially the root of ignorance. And when we remove that root, we remove the affliction. Very simple logic to this. So he says they also do not exist in between or somewhere else. We can't find some other location for them. So he then says, since it is like this, where can the afflictions that were uprooted in this way and which exist from their own side go to inflict harm? Because no such afflictions exist from their own side. But if this is the case of what we talked about, well, then they have no residence. They have no place that they can go to where they can, be and continue to torment our minds. They do not abide anywhere, he says. These afflictions are like illusions, as Shantideva said. They are empty of inherent existence and yet appear as if they exist from their own side. So they do have that, just like everything in our world. This is what those stains, the smell of the garlic in the pot, the stains in our own minds cause everything to appear to exist from its own side. They have that appearance, but that appearance is false. And if we investigate, we can undermine that that is not reality. We can definitely see that the falsehood there. So he says, therefore, abandon the fear in your heart that they cannot be abandoned because of existing inherently. They don't exist inherently, so they can be abandoned. They can be changed. They can be destroyed because they lack inherent existence. If they had inherent existence, they would be there all the time. Just a little bit more, and we'll do the final prayers. I did want to go ahead and try to finish this chapter, but I'm just going to at least finish this section. Gyaltsab Je continues, having generated the wisdom that realized emptiness, it is suitable to strive in abandoning the mental afflictions. Since one has this ability, why would one create meaninglessly the harm of the lower realms, of the hells, and so forth? This is unsuitable. So this is the idea that, again, if we really have conviction that the afflictions can be removed, that there is an antidote to them that is final, that ultimate antidote of the wisdom of emptiness, well, then we should be making great effort. We should be so enthusiastic to do this work, because we'll see that not only will we be able to be free ourselves from that, but we will also then be on our way to achieving enlightenment for the sake of others, and we can then help them to do the same work. So that's as far as I was able to get tonight, but I really appreciate you both being here and hanging out with me in terms of this teaching. And if there aren't any other questions or comments, we'll go ahead and do the dedication prayers. One thing I might mention, and I'll maybe have Jennifer and Maria send out something. It's looking like I'm not going to be going to the prison. I normally was canceling the class on the first Monday of each month because of going to the prison where I teach, and they're not allowing anyone to come into the prison right now with the conditions that are going on. So with that in mind, I was thinking I could certainly offer to do a class that night. Maybe we'll be able to finish the text then, the chapter 5, before I get on the road. If I get on the road. Of course, I don't know any of this. For all of us, we're dealing with so much uncertainty, which of course us human beings don't like, right? But I just have to live with that uncertainty. But at some point I thought, if I'm having things canceled that I would normally be doing, I'm happy to offer to do teachings. We might need more teachings to get through this chapter 5, which we haven't even started yet, has quite a bit to it. And I think I only had 6 classes lined up to go through chapter 5. So I may want to add another 1 or so. But anyway, just my thoughts rambling here a little bit. Let me go ahead and pull up the prayers again. We can do those together. There we go. Okay, so we pass through the Heart Sutra. We go to the page for the recitations after the teachings. We're going to do the first dedication prayer here. We'll just do this in thinking about everything we've accumulated by being here tonight and participating in this class, all that positive potential, becoming the cause for all sentient beings to attain enlightenment through our own attainment of that state. Due to the merits of these virtuous actions, may I quickly attain the state of a Guru Buddha and lead all living beings without exception into that enlightened state. May the supreme jewel bodhicitta that has not arisen arise and grow, and may that which has arisen not diminish, but increase more and more. Now let's turn our attention to our spiritual teachers. We're going to recite 2 prayers, one for His Holiness and one for Lama Zopa. As we recite those, we can think about all the spiritual guides that exist in this world, whether they be in our tradition or any other tradition. May we and others who depend upon such guides always have perfect guides in our lives, through them having good health and long lives, through our merits that we've created here tonight. the wish-granting, wish-fulfilling jewel, source of every single benefit and happiness in this world, to the incomparably kind Tenzin Gyatso I beseech, may all your holy wishes be spontaneously fulfilled. You who uphold the subduer's moral way, who serve as the bountiful bearer of all, sustaining, preserving, spreading Manjunath's victorious doctrine, who masterfully accomplish magnificent prayers honoring the three jewels, Savior of myself and others, your disciples, please, please live long. And lastly, we might dedicate for those that we're holding in our hearts, certainly during this time, what's going on. Some of you may even know people who are affected by this illness. And if that's the case, you can bring them to mind directly, but we can think in general about all the people, beings around the world who are affected by this virus, even those who are dealing with the fear from this virus, the anxiety that this is producing in our world. Any other beings that we bring to mind who are experiencing obstacles or difficulties, who are ill, who are dying, who have died, dedicate very strongly for their welfare. Through holding them in our hearts, we create that very special connection with them and want them to benefit from what we've done here tonight, and for them to all find the causes that lead to perfect happiness. And may all beings find true happiness through what we've done here tonight. Okay, thank you all so much. I really appreciate you being here, and have a safe week, and I'll be back again next Monday for the continuation of this class.